Hey everybody, hope that you are all feeling healthy and aren't too cooped up yet. It looks like we've got a little bit left to ride out on this storm. Here's our first lesson, and I want to do things a little bit backward. I've been thinking a lot about this. I've been putting a lot of background work into what's going to be in these videos because I want them to make sense to you. I want them to be interesting enough to hold your attention, and I want them to teach you something. Some things that I think a lot of people don't know that I think people would like to know. It's worth knowing whether Christianity has a foundation in a miracle or in a lie. That affects how I see the world. So I want an answer to that question. Here are the facts as we know them so far. All right. First of all, we know that the disciples boldly preached the resurrection only days after Christ's crucifixion. We know that they preached to huge crowds. They were up against the Jewish authorities at first, then the Roman authorities. They were persecuted at every turn. Many of the disciples were tortured for their faith. And all 11 out of the 12 apostles ended up dying for the cause. There are also reports of over 500 witnesses that attest to seeing Jesus after his death. And then from there, Christianity spread like wildfire through the known world. We also know that Jesus was put to death, and we know that his tomb was found empty. That being said, I think it's worth still taking a skeptical approach. And having been, at one point in my life, very dubious about religion, very skeptical. I was like St. Thomas here. St. Thomas said, unless I can put my finger into the nail marks, unless I can put my hand into Christ's side, unless I see with my own eyes that he has risen, I will not believe. Difficult as all these other things are to reconcile, right? Why would Christianity spring up out of Messianic Judaism if Jesus was killed on the cross, right? Totally defeated by the Messiah's enemies, the Romans. Makes no sense that he would be called the Messiah. Why would they say that he rose from the dead in not the legendary fashion that would develop over time, but through very early accounts go straight back to the cross? How can they make that dramatic shift in mentality from being afraid and hiding to going out and dying for this cause? A lot of things that we can't reconcile about how Christianity began. Even skeptical atheist scholars contend that the apostles believed that they saw something. They believed that Jesus was back alive because it's impossible to explain Christianity without that. That being said, a person resurrecting from the dead, that is no small thing. A person resurrecting from the dead is basically so improbable that almost anything else is a preferable explanation. We come back to Sherlock Holmes and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's famous line that once we've eliminated the impossible, whatever else remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Well, rising from the dead is, as far as we know, impossible. So you're going to need an extremely compelling reason to say anything other than that. I'm sorry, but that's where I come down on this one. But wait. Take a look at this image behind me. This is a picture of St. Peter and St. John, right after they heard from Mary Magdalene that the tomb was empty. And first, Mary Magdalene doesn't even assume that Jesus has risen from the dead. She says someone has taken the body and we don't know what they've done with it. Peter and John rush to the tomb. And when they get there, the scripture says Simon Peter, following him, John, also came up, went into the tomb, saw the linen cloth lying on the ground, and also the cloth that had been put over his head, Jesus' head. This was not with the linen cloth, but rolled up in a place by itself. Some translations say folded up. Whatever happened to that linen? Well, it turns out we actually still have the cloth. or at least there is a cloth out there that people claim is the same cloth. So this leaves me with two main questions. One is there any evidence that suggests that this really is the cloth of Jesus? Can we demonstrate that it might be, that it probably is, that it's very doubtful? Let's find out that question. Question number two is there any evidence on this thing that suggests that Jesus rose from the dead? So let's take a look at all the evidence together. First, I want to show you something crazy about this shroud here. Take a look. Up here is the shroud image. Those white spots are places where they're actually holes in the shroud from a fire. It was folded up, and the fire actually burnt a small corner of the shroud. Fortunately, someone was able to rescue the shroud before the whole thing burned. Now, if you look at the bottom slide, you can see that those holes have been digitally removed. And anywhere where there is blood on this shroud has actually been colored in red. So if you look carefully, you may not notice it at first, but if you tilt your head sideways, you'll see there is actually a very clear image of a bearded man on this shroud. And we'll talk about how we know that there's actual blood on here and that it's not just paint in a moment. But just take a look at this graphic for a moment and see if you notice anything about it. Now, this shroud was said to be the shroud of Jesus. And then in the late 19th century, photography had just been invented, and someone went and actually took a picture of this thing. And I don't know if you know this, but when you're developing, before selfies and cell phones, you wanted to develop a photo, you had to develop a negative. A negative is basically all the exact opposite colors are on that negative image. And then you use that negative image to create the regular photo. And so the photographer had taken pictures, and take a look at what he saw. If you look at the top image here, you can see a very ghostly image of the body on the shroud. Look at how clearly the features come out when it's in this photo negative form. When this picture was taken, it shocked the photographer that all of this detail was preserved on this shroud, and you couldn't really necessarily notice it with the naked eye. This bottom image, again, has just simply removed the hole so you can see a little bit better the shape and form of the person. And you notice there's the front here and the back here, because this cloth was laid over the top of the person, front and back. In this image, I've turned the shroud right side up so that you can kind of see the features of the man a little bit better. And we have here each one of the images side by side. So you can see this is the original shroud image. This is what it looks like. The contrast on this might be enhanced a little bit so the image is less faint. And then you can see here somebody has highlighted where there is blood on this shroud. And you can see a couple interesting things here. One thing to note is notice the wounds. There are nail marks in the hands and in the feet. If you look closely at the top here, you will see markings of wounds to the head. Looks like where a crown of thorns would have been. And you can see this big red blotch here is a wound to the side. And if you look carefully, all of these other little marks all over the body, particularly on the back, they are scourge marks of somebody who has been whipped. And the shape even is extremely distinctive of a little type of metal that was used in a scourging by Romans in the 1st century. So what does this mean? We can see that the shroud bears the marks of a crucified man. And the body was scourged front and back by Roman weapons. This person was beaten. We can see evidence of that in the shape, and there's actually chemical evidence in the cloth from contusions. We can get into that. We see that this person appears to have been crowned with thorns, pierced in the side. All of these wounds are the exact wounds you would expect from Jesus' body. In fact, if you read the gospel accounts, you hear that all of these things happened to Jesus.